To now continue the case for the opposition, it's a privilege to introduce the award-winning writer and Mail and Sunday columnist, Peter Hitchens. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Mr. President. Wonderful, isn't it, what you can do by telling a few hundred extremely well-fed people who are sitting in a temple of privilege that they're hard done by. I was going to begin by expatiating briefly on the style of evening wear now favoured by the Conservative and Unionist Party. It may be that they're trying to avoid anyone thinking they're in the Bullingdon Club, but have you ever seen anybody looking so much as if they were dressed for an evening with Comrade Mao Zedong? However, that has almost no bearing whatsoever on what I wish to say, whatever that was. Yes, it is wonderful being young. I too once knew everything, and it's taken me a long time to get over it. I was indeed a rioter. In fact, if those of you who wish to discover how I became such a black-hearted reactionary can find all the details in my book, The Cameron Delusion, which is not available in all leading bookstores, for reasons you'll find out in a minute. No, I was indeed a teenage writer. I rioted in Grosvenor Square against the Vietnam War in March 1968. I threw clods of mud at the police. I have absolutely no idea why I did it, and I can't justify it for a second. I took part in a very rowdy demonstration outside what was then the embassy, I suppose, of Southern Rhodesia in the Strand, which ended with the smashing of windows in South Africa House. And while I still would not breathe a word in defense of either the apartheid regime or the Southern Rhodesian government of Ian Smith, I have to admit to some perplexity at the outcome of the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe. And in 1968, I took part in a demonstration against Mr. Enoch Powell's policies on immigration outside Oxford Town Hall, and actually succeeded in bursting through the police line, and had this extraordinary revelation of wondering what on earth I should do next. Was I to rush into the town hall and grab Mr. Powell by his natty gentleman's suitings and give him a piece of my mind? No. I melted very rapidly into the crowd, realizing that I actually had achieved nothing whatsoever. And finally, I was in a fracas outside a recruiting office in York after the Bloody Sunday events in Londonderry in 1972. Now, many of these things I don't entirely regret the sentiments, though sometimes I don't understand them, which I held at the time, though there were sentiments and there were objectives to what I was doing, but I do very much regret the methods. Because in a free society, if I'll finish this point, in a free society in which freedom of speech and thought are possible, taking to the streets with violent intent is, as far as I'm concerned, inexcusable. And in an ordered society, breaking the order and peace of that society is not merely inexcusable, but highly dangerous. Sorry, did somebody? Yes.
The current speaker says that in his youth he was a rioter, he broke the police line. Mm-hmm. Does he think that when he did that, he should have had his housing taken away from him?
Had my what taken away from me?
Your housing. You should have been kicked out of your housing, that you should have had your sole source of income taken away from you, and that all of your family should have had the same removed.
No, I don't think that, and I don't think it now either. And in fact, I've spoken against that proposition. I don't believe in that use of the welfare system for collective punishment. I believe in the use of the criminal justice system. So I neither thought it then, nor do I think it now. Now, we have another problem here, which is the rather deeper one, and this is where I very much do differ with my colleague, Mr. Blunt, and where I also differ very much with Mr. Tully over the real subjects, which as I understand it, of our discussions this evening, which are the outbreaks of violent disorder and criminal behavior last summer, rather politely known as riots. I don't refer to them as riots if I can possibly help it, because I don't believe they could even be dignified by that term. And I think that what they were, and the reason why they attracted so much attention, were they were a concentrated version, in very, very highly inflamed and concentrated in time and in place, of what is happening in very large parts of most of our cities most of the time, but on a small scale to one or two people and by one or two people, not by several hundred or by several thousand. People are robbed, people are menaced, people are intimidated, things are set on fire and destroyed and vandalized. An enormous amount of pointless and futile spite is at large in our society. I don't seek in any way to excuse the behavior of those people. As far as I'm concerned, I make no excuses for my behavior in the past or their behavior now. Some things are wrong and they are not excusable by any manner of social troubles or bad background or anything else anyone cares to advance. That doesn't mean, however, that we cannot look at what happened last summer and say to ourselves that some things were done which were wrong. The reason why I don't really care how you vote on this motion, because I straddle both sides of it, is first of all that I think that the government itself is a hopelessly flabby and pathetic apology for a Conservative government and has no rights to term itself anything of the kind. It isn't really in any case. And that its feebleness of approach demonstrated by Mr. Blunt, who came out with the standard excuse that people who've been in prison then commit more offences, as if this was somehow a consequence of failed rehabilitation policies. The reason why people who've been in prison in this country commit more offences is because it's much, much harder to get into prison in this country than it is to get into university. You have to keep on trying. First of all, they don't do anything, then they give you a caution, then they give you another caution, then they give you another caution, then they give you a fine, then you don't pay that, then they give you another fine, you don't pay that, then they give you another fine, you don't pay that, then they give you a suspended sentence, which they don't apply, and then another one, which they don't apply, and then they give you a community punishment. And after 15 goes, they might just send you to prison. Well, by that time, it's very likely that you will have become a habitual criminal, and it won't be terribly surprising if you then commit another offence. Mr. Blunt won't actually recognise this simple point. Well, you'd have to cite your research. I've seen absolutely nothing which. Sorry? Oh, well, it must be right then. I've seen absolutely nothing to suggest anything of the kind, rather the reverse. Some excellent work by the Policy Exchange think tank on the subject should set you right. Come to me afterwards if you want a reference. Now, where was I? Yes, Mr. Blunt, his feebleness. No, the feebleness of the Conservative Liberal government, the feebleness of the previous Conservative government, the feebleness of the previous Labour government, the feebleness of the Conservative government before that, and the feebleness of the Labour government before that. One could go back, and indeed one should, because this isn't a matter of governments, this is a matter of culture. We have, actually since the days when I was demonstrating against Mr. Enoch Powell, and since before that, been dismantling in our society something much, much, much more important than the money that the proposition seem to be obsessed with. Money doesn't actually, despite Mrs. Thatcher's apparent belief in this, money doesn't actually make the world go round. Money doesn't actually hold societies together. Money isn't actually the key to everything. What is the key to everything in society is morality. People's willingness to behave well towards their neighbours without being coerced into doing so. And that is what we have systematically destroyed by a series of social policies so insane that nobody ever, ever considers repealing them. Yes, indeed. Where are you? Well, I can't discuss what was or wasn't reported because it wasn't good news, though I don't know how many of you in this room actually read newspapers anymore. It seems to be a declining habit among the educated elite, but it is, I'm afraid, the case that if newspapers were produced which were full of good news, nobody would buy them. And I regret this as much as anybody, but newspapers are ultimately commercial propositions. And although they do the best they can to contain as much responsible truth as they can conceivably cram in, they have to sell themselves to a public which has to be persuaded to buy them. It can't be made to buy them the way people are made to have the BBC, license by threats of imprisonment. We have to get people to buy our newspapers voluntarily, and we couldn't be a free and independent press otherwise. Undoubtedly, the media have played their part in the degeneration of our culture. Stupid to pretend otherwise. But I have to say I think that television has played a larger part in that than any other medium. And for any discussion of that, I should refer you to my other book, The Abolition of Britain, also not available in any leading bookstore. The point that I would like to conclude on is this, that, as I say, it is not money, it is not whether people are compelled to borrow for their education, it's not whether people are actually living on fairly reduced circumstances, or whether they're eating particularly well, or whether they can turn the central heating up high, or whether the government is lavishing huge quantities of money on the education system, which matters. 50 years ago, about 40% of the people in this room would have been from grammar schools. State schools for which there were no fees, which were destroyed wantonly by Labour and Conservative governments. And they were not destroyed in a frenzy of cuts. On the contrary, the money that's been lavished on the state education system on the disastrous comprehensive experiment has been far, far greater. The question was, were we prepared to have a system which had selection and rigor in it? And we weren't. Were we prepared to have a society in which marriage was supported so that so many people were not subjected to divorce of their parents and so many people would not be brought up without fathers? Were we prepared to have authority in general in our society, both among adults and in the police and in the courts? Or were we to construct a cardboard criminal justice system which actually doesn't work? And anybody in this room, and maybe there are some who have been the victims of the crime and disorder, which is actually not particularly prevalent in the sort of parts of society in which you live, but very prevalent elsewhere. Anybody who has been a victim of that will long for there to be more authority and more morality in our society, not less. These things are not bought with money. They're bought with cultural and moral determination of the kind which the current government and previous governments have lacked, which academics have lacked, which teachers have lacked, which policemen have lacked, and which in general our society has lacked, and which need to be put back in if we are to have a civilization. Money won't do it. Morality will. I don't care how you vote, as long as you take on board that proposition. Thank you very much.